All right, it's 1 o'clock, and so I'm going to call to order the meeting, the 32nd public meeting of the Massachusetts Gaming Commission. Two of our members, Chairman Crosby and Commissioner Cameron, are in the Far East getting some learning and information that will be helpful to all of us as we move forward. So the three of us will proceed, and I'll call the meeting to order. The first order of business is the minutes of October 9, of the October 9, 2012 meeting. I distributed those. I've found, I must say, a couple of typos in them, but would welcome substantive comments if there are any, and then see if we can approve them.
Mr. Chairman, I just had one. Page 6, where we're talking about our meeting out in Holyoke. The last line, I thought the community college representatives were hoping to present a finalized plan to the commission in November, not February.
In November, okay. All right, any other corrections apart from typos?
My only comment was perhaps one of the typos that you were alluding to on page 3. But other than that, there's a word that's repeated.
Yes, I got that. Thank you, though. Yeah.
Other than that, I reviewed them and found them in good order.
Okay. Then I'd move that the October 9, the minutes of the October 9 meeting be approved.
Second.
Discussion, I think we've already had the discussion, so all in favor?
Aye.
And the minutes are approved. Now, the October 16 meeting was a long one, and I did not get the materials until late on Friday, understandably, so I'll have those minutes ready for approval at the next meeting. They're not ready today. So that takes us to item 3 on the agenda, the consultant status report. Is there any representative of the gaming consultants here today? There is not. We had an extensive report last week, and we are going to have a meeting next Monday that we'll talk about more in this meeting. And we have some other things to talk about today in any event. So is there anything under that topic, Commissioner, that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I believe Director Glovsky was prepared to give us a bit of a summary of.
Yeah, I was going to do it as part of my.
Okay.
Okay.
Then that would be.
Okay, so we'll get to that. We'll get to that in a minute. Although maybe what you have to say will provide a platform for some of the other discussions. So maybe we ought to take your report out of order right now.
Okay, sure. Well, I can do just the consulting piece now, if you like.
No, why don't we
Okay.
do it all together, and
All
then
right.
we just don't have to have so much shifting around.
All right.
So welcome back.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back, and it was good to do this update with the consultants over the phone today to catch up on the things that happened last week in my absence. I know that in addition to being at the public meeting on Tuesday last week, the consultants spent time in the office on Wednesday, October 17th with a number of meetings, as well as conducting some phone meetings subsequent to that. There were discussions with commission members to identify and prioritize policy determinations that are preconditions to drafting Phase 2 regulations, and I think some of that may be discussed later on today. I know that the consultants worked with you all to develop a schedule and sequence for making policy decisions based on the priorities assigned. Really looking at policy direction, communications, methodology in terms of how we're going to communicate with host communities and applicants, which I just think that that's in process at this particular point in time. And I know that they're working on continuing to assist in identifying and evaluating potential candidates for open staff positions. I know that Commissioner Stebbins met with them to discuss certifying curriculum for gaming education and what the most appropriate method would be for doing that. In addition, they were I think, pretty much involved with scheduling and providing some logistical and other support for the meetings that are going to happen next week, the October 29th scope of licensing meeting with the applicants and the individual scope of licensing meetings that are expected to take place after that meeting next week. And they began to respond to questions and comments from the commission about the revised draft strategic plan, which was delivered on October 15th.
On the last item, the revised draft strategic plan, what do you know what the next step with that is? Are they anticipating, and I know you've been away, so this might be an unfair question, and maybe somebody else knows. Do you know what the next, are they anticipating another set of comments from us before finalizing it, or is this essentially the final product from their standpoint, from the consultant standpoint?
I couldn't say one way or another. I know that the draft documents after our initial comments are now in our possession. And whether there's another pass at this or not, I believe there was an initial question not too long ago as to whether we would adopt that plan formally here by vote of the commission. So in anticipation of that, maybe we could really study those revised addenda.
Okay, let's do that then and try to move that forward either to the next iteration, so that we can get to a final plan. And in that regard, it may be that some of the recommendations that the consultants made with respect to the policy issues, which we're going to discuss today or begin the discussion of today, maybe some of that needs to be incorporated into the strategic plan, and maybe some of the timelines can need to be adjusted in light of that. So those are at least two items that we need to think about in terms of turning the next version around.
Right, and I think we'll also have to make a decision about how we want to view the strategic plan, because in some sense, it will get approved in some way, but it also becomes a living document that we'll be adding to and changing as we go forward. So I think we'll have to make a decision about when we want the commission to approve it at a particular point and use it as the basis for continuing our work going forwards.
Yeah, I think that's really an important consideration. It's not fixed, and by the nature of things, it can't be fixed. We're constantly going to be trying to update and improve on the timelines, no matter what they turn out to be, if we can do so consistent with a deliberate and sound and thoughtful approach. So
I do know that they are working on a work plan for us. We provided them with a form that we wanted them to produce their work plan in, and that they are working on that piece. And to a certain extent, I view that, along with the formalization of the comments that you have, is sort of the final piece of this part of the strategic plan. And then moving forward, because we have to be careful. We don't want to keep them working on it too long when we need them to be working on the policy stuff going forwards.
What's the work plan?
The work plan is really going to be a document. It's sort of in a spreadsheet format that takes specific steps that are listed within their timeline right now, but also will assign staff to it from their point, and I think that they'll do a first pass on which commissioner that they think will be working with it. It's really our communal attempt to make the next part of the process less of a black box for everybody. That, on section 1.2, Commissioner McHugh is going to be working on it, and you'll be working on it with this person from Spectrum and this person from Michael and Carol, so that at any time, any of the commissioners can take a look at the tasks that need to be done, know which ones they're expected to have a hand in participating in, and understand who's handling other ones as well.
That'll be enormously valuable, and it ties into the discussion we're going to have in a little while about the preliminary policy issues, I think, very nicely. And how will that, and we're at a 50,000-foot level, but how will that tie back into the PMA plan?
I think that they'll, in some sense, all be iterative. But I think that's one place where we can start for our resource loading. I know that that was something that we wanted to try and do with the PMA scheduling plan, but until we have a sense of who's working on what and how long things are going to take, it makes it very difficult to do the resource loading. And my expectation is that we would start the resource loading sort of at the 50,000-foot level and then drill down on particular areas from there.
In addition to that, the work plan, if you will, has a bit of a framework that is particular to the gaming consultants, whereas PMA is also helping us with activities that are more relying on stuff that's coming up, a research agenda, other mega processes, if you will, that are incumbent of the Commission as well. So I would call that a subset without the timing element, because there's also a lot of, as you suggested, a lot of recurring activities within that work plan with our consultants. It's very hard to put a date limit to some of them.
Right.
Others, it's very straightforward. So.
Okay, that's helpful. And for all of those to whom this all sounds like simply a proliferation of acronyms, what we're trying to do is now move toward the second phase, the site-specific phase of the licensing process. And in connection with that, there are a host of policy issues that we've got to resolve, and we're going to talk about those in a few minutes. And the questions we've been discussing here now have to do with how we're going to create plans so that we know who's working on what policy issues when, so that we can move forward on a number of fronts at the same time and have a coordinated set of milestones and tracking devices so we can see where we are and make sure that we stay on track. So that's what this last piece of discussion was about, and how to incorporate the various plans that we have and will need in order to deal with all of those policy decisions, and then the regulation writing that's going to come right after those, while at the same time proceeding with the investigation of the qualifiers who have filed applications in the Phase 1 process. So we've got a lot of things going on, and obviously need to coordinate them through these various plans. Okay. Did you want to give, as long as you're here, did you want to give the rest of your report?
Right. The only other things that I wanted to note, we have several RFRs that are in process. We have one for stenographic services. There's one for investigative services. And in addition, on Compass, within the, again, acronyms, ITS 43, which is a state contract for temporary assistance, I have posted a temp to perm position for someone to do some research on the document management software that we need to get in, to have someone come in, take a look at the different options, contact the vendors, help us write a procurement if necessary, and see where that takes us. I really look at it as sort of staff augmentation. It's a task that needs to be done, that we really don't have the resources in-house to accomplish it as well as I would like it to be done, or as quickly as I would like it to be done. Additionally, we have a posting on CEO for a senior business operations specialist, which would be someone that I view as coming in to work for me, who would be able to handle some of the accounting and information technology things that we're working at. We don't really have a full job in any of those areas, but someone who has multiple skills and talents is what we're looking at, and we seem to have had a number of responses come in over the past week, and I look forward to reviewing those.
Remind us, this posting is for a contract position?
The ITS 43 is for a contract position, whereas the one on CEO is for a permanent position.
Yep.
And how about the document management position?
That's the contractor.
Okay.
But I posted it as a temp to permanent position. If we got someone in a temporary position who, we were happy with, we would certainly, consider bringing them on board to
Okay.
implement.
So at what point in that process, on the document management process, do we need to create the policies that the software is going to manage? Early, right?
I think early, but in some of my initial conversations with the vendors, I think most of the vendors that I've talked to 2 vendors, they seem to have what we're looking for in general, which is really an all-encompassing archive. I mean, one of the things that they talk about is the ability to delete stuff after a certain period of time, which clearly is not something that we would want. But there are rules that get set up with the implementation of the software. So in some sense, making sure that we have a good outline of the policies, maybe not the specifics, as we go into the procurement process, so we can be very specific about what our needs are, and then the implementation of those policies in the rulemaking process when the software is implemented.
Well, I'm thinking maybe we're talking about the same thing. I'm thinking about the coding of documents so that in response to a Freedom of Information Act request, you can easily retrieve relevant documents. I'm thinking about a system that can be coded to deal with the document retention policies of the Secretary of State. And there are a variety of other things that we will want to do, even though we're not required by law to do them, to make our lives
Right. Both of those
simple.
options as examples are pieces that we would have in the procurement, that we would need them to be able to allow us to specify our own rules for putting keywords in for our ability to get it back. But the systems that I've looked at, in addition to allowing for that, really do have the ability to do sort of a global search, so that you could put in, if a word came up that you needed to go search for in response to a public records request or anything else, that you, even if it wasn't specified as a keyword, you would still be able to search for the document that
Okay.
way.
All right, and that's helpful. I just and maybe we ought to talk. I'm sure we'll talk further
Yes.
about this before we go forward. It seems to me that we need to think through perhaps at a high level the kinds of statutory and
Right.
policy objectives that we're trying to meet through this system, and having the specs embody those objectives, self-imposed and externally imposed.
Yeah, I do view that as being something that we would have in the procurement, because it wouldn't do us any good to purchase a system that didn't meet those requirements.
Right. Okay.
I was wondering if you were also thinking about what I would term procedures, if you will, relative to some of the aspects or attributes of systems like these. Perhaps you're labeling them policy questions, but this notion of metadata or criteria that we would attach to or tag each piece of documents that we possess, receive, and create. There's as part of the procurement, we need to think through how we're going to go about cataloging, if you will, each document to the extent that a software can help us retrieve that,
Right.
in a helpful way. And perhaps that's what, maybe now we're repeating ourselves, but that's also, as far as I can understand it, what we want to have this person help us do.
Right, and we need to make sure we have
Yeah.
flexible ability to do that as well.
Right. It seems to me, yes, and that was included in what I was talking about, but it seems to me that and that's why I think this is a discussion that, I don't know when we have it, but I think we need to have it among
Okay.
all of us, because to the extent you impose, for example, a whole bunch of coding requirements
Yeah.
on documents, they aren't going to get coded, and so we need to have the flexibility to look for things with with a minimum amount of front-end loading and the kind of
Yes.
the searching capabilities and the like. But at the same time, we have to know what kind of policies we're going to have to comply with to make the thing work, so.
That's a perennial question with software. People will come in and sell it that it's customizable,
Right.
but,
Right.
to
You
the
have to,
extent
you
that
have
we
to put the
customize
rules in to make it
Yeah.
customizable, and
Right.
and that becomes the challenge.
Right,
yeah.
right. Okay.
So
All
again,
right.
this is my first day back after 6 days out. That's all I have.
Okay,
That's fine.
great. Good to have you back.
Thank you.
All right, so that report really sets the framework for the discussion that we'll have for the next few minutes. The next step in the Phase 2 process, going to item 3B, the next step in the Phase 2 process is the meeting that we'll have on October 29, a week from yesterday, next Monday, at the Sheraton Framingham at 10 o'clock. And that will be a so-called scope of licensing meeting. The details are posted on the website, and we will have that meeting at which the gaming consultants will be present. They'll explain the general parameters of the Phase 1 process, talk about the criteria for determining who qualifiers are, and the process that they will follow in conducting, or not that they will follow, that the IEB, more about that in a second, will follow during the qualification investigations that are following the Phase 1 applications. So all who are preparing to or thinking about, or even if they're unsure about filing an application before the deadline of January 15, are welcome to attend that meeting. It's open to the public. It is a public meeting, and so it will be held there and then. And that will be followed by 3 days of individual meetings between the consultants and the individual applicants to go over specific questions that individual applicants have about their specific Phase 1 application, and try to resolve as many questions about who has to qualify, who has to file, and other kinds of like questions that arise. So those are designed to help all of the applicants get off to a fast start and figure out where any difficulties lie, and any things and any issues that may ultimately have to be decided by the commission. But the first step are these meetings to try, hopefully, to iron out all of those problems. It would be enormously helpful if anyone who plans to attend next week's meeting, the big meeting on Monday, would register. The registration mechanism is posted on the website, and it would be very helpful to us to know who's planning to attend, and also to create in the process a list of people for whom, to whom we can send notices if necessary as other events and issues arise during the Phase 1 process. So that mechanism is there, and people are encouraged to use it. Is there anything else that we ought to talk about?
Can I make a question just
Yeah, sure.
for clarification? These meetings are available but not required, is that correct?
That's right.
Of potential applicants?
Right. Nobody has to show up either at the public meeting or at the individual meetings. But this is the main opportunity to, well, it is the only opportunity to get an early read on what applicants are going to have to do in terms of filling out the RFA1 application, who the qualifiers are, and what documents are going to be required, any questions or issues about the portions of the specimen documents that the commission has labeled as presumptively non-public. All of that is open for discussion. The last piece, not so much discussion, but is open for discussion at these meetings and will be explored at these meetings. Any other thoughts about that? So that's really to get this piece, this Phase 1 piece off to to a more or less formal start. Both the Phase 1 application for the Class 1 and Class 2 licenses were issued last week. The Class 2 license on Wednesday and the Class 1 licenses on Friday, and so now the commission is now in the process of accepting applications for the Phase 1 applications, that is, for all gaming licenses. It is empowered to issue. Gaming facility licenses, it's empowered to issue. And the licensing period, as I said, remains open until January 15. Okay, item 3C focuses on the RFA2 process, what comes behind the RFA1 process. And some of this is yet to be resolved, but at a high level, I think it's fair to say, and we can talk about that for a second in a minute, that the RFA1 deadline is January 15th. I've said that now 3 times. The investigations will go on of the qualifiers for a period of time that we expect to end in June, and then the commission will make a qualification decision, who's qualified and who isn't qualified. While that's going on, the commission's going to be engaged in preparing for the RFA2 process and to issue the RFA2, the RFA2s. And so while that investigation and process is going on, the commission's going to be engaged in making policy decisions that will underlie the RFA2 regulations. We'll issue another set of regulations, just the way we did the RFA1s. We're hopeful that we can make those policy research and make judgments about the policies that we need to have in place to issue those regulations during the month of November. Try to set the policies in place in early December, and then begin writing the regulations that will support those policies to the extent we need regulations to do so. We may be able to just create regulations to, policies to stand by themselves. And then the regulations themselves will be issued by June, and will be available by the time the RFA 2 applications are ready for issuing. The idea behind issuing, thinking about and deciding on these policies is twofold. One, to support the regulations, to give us guidance as to what regulations we need to issue, and to make sure we haven't overlooked anything. And secondly, and equally important, if not more so, to give applicants and municipalities an early view of what the policies are that are going to be embodied in the regulations so that planning can proceed. It's going to take us a while to issue the regulations. The planning and negotiations are going on now, and ought to be going on now, and they ought to be going on in an enlightened fashion. So we're trying by this policy creation mechanism to lay out an array, a menu, if you will, of policies that are going to be found in the regulations. There'll be some slight changes, but the major decisions we hope will be made in December so that people can plan and continue the planning with some firm idea in mind as to what the regulations are going to look like and what's going to be required of them on both sides, on the municipal side and on the developer side. I think that covers basically what the objectives are.
Yep.
And what we're going to try to do. This is in some ways, some parts of this are highly plastic because things are going to change as we acquire more information. We may find that, and inevitably will find, that additional policies need to be confronted and created as we move forward with the actual writing process. But at least some of the big picture questions can be answered, I think, early on. All right. Anything?
No, I
more on
think
that?
it's well articulated. I think that the two-goal piece that you articulate is very insightful in terms of how we're trying to signal what's useful, if you will, for potential applicants in preparing the responses, because these responses, as per the statute, are going to be very detailed, very rich in a lot of information and a lot of due diligence, in a lot of studies that need to be considered if they haven't already. And that's a paramount goal of everybody here. So.
Anything?
No, I
Commissioner? All
think
right.
the process as you've laid it out was perfectly clear for anybody who's watching.
Okay. Now, item 3D deals with an integral part of that process, and that's the formal organization of the Investigation and Enforcement Bureau. The statute provides that when the applications are filed, the commission will ask the Investigation and Enforcement Bureau, the IEB for short, to commence an investigation as to the qualifications of the applicants. That's basically the Phase 1 process. So the Phase 1 process is in the hands of the IEB. And the question is, first of all, how we create the IEB, what formalities do we have to use to create the IEB? The answer to that is essentially that we announce we've created it and appoint a director. So that is something that we're in the process now of doing. There is a search being conducted by Commissioner Cameron for a director of the Investigation and Enforcement Bureau. And when that person is hired, and we anticipate that will be very shortly, and in any event, well before the end of the year, then the Bureau will be created. He or she will be in charge of the Bureau, and they will have responsibility for the investigations. We've already had contact with the state police, who will be a component of the IEB, and if the need be, we can arrange for temporary support from the state police while we're getting around to the formal naming of the IEB. But in any event, we will have that ready to go on schedule. I don't think there's anything more we need to talk about on that item. But that's basically how we will set it up. And in connection with that, item 3E focuses on the enhanced ethics requirements that we are required by statute to create. And that set of enhanced ethics standards will apply to us. It will apply to the state police who work with us, both in the IEB and elsewhere. And it will apply to the Alcoholic Beverages Control Commission personnel who work with us. And the Attorney General is required to create a separate enhanced ethics standard to apply to the gaming division that the Attorney General has set up. So we are in the process of working on that new ethics standards. We've had several meetings already and are going to, in the process of dealing with these policies that we're going to turn to in just a second, meet again with the stakeholders in the ethics process and have the enhanced ethics standards ready by the time we're ready to move forward as well. I don't know if there's anything else we can say about that. Anything you want to say, Commissioner?
No, I guess just by way of, is there any idea as to the timeline of the creation of these enhanced code of ethics?
Well, there isn't any firm timeline, but I would very much hope that we could have that in place by no later than the end of the year. We're going to begin and have begun a hiring process. We're going to be staffing up and gearing up to deal with the investigations, and I think that ought to be that set of standards ought to be in place in the near term. And I think it can be. We've had a couple of good meetings, and I think we need to go back and finish up those meetings and get the standards set up. And so I think by no later than the end of the year, we'll have that in place, and hopefully sooner.
I'm assuming, because you're talking about the end of the year, that we don't have to go through any official regulatory approval
No, this would be a policy that would be applicable to the commission and the ABCC personnel and the state police. Each unit, particularly the ABCC and the state police, may have to go through some internal approvals. But that's just part of the process. It's not going to take the form of a regulation. It's going to be a policy. And it will be published on our website and part of our employee handbook, and that's the way we'll create it and enforce it, I think.
Is there any benefit of putting these out for, again, the general public to kind of offer their comments or thoughts or opinions on?
I think that would be a helpful process, a helpful part of the process. This is designed to, of course, everybody on the commission is governed by the state ethics laws. And so that's a given. And these ethics requirements under the statute are to be more strict than those. And so I think that's an excellent suggestion, Commissioner. I think we should put it out for at least public comment for some period as we're moving forward before we finally adopt it. And there'll be time to do that. So I think that's a good idea.
That's great.
Okay, any other discussion on that? So that brings us then to the preliminary discussion of policy priorities. And in everybody's packet is a list that we created, a preliminary list, again with some typos. But it's a preliminary list of policy areas, I think it's fair to say, where we need to think about policies and ultimately regulations. And the purpose of that today, we have two commissioners who are absent, and we're not going to talk about any substantive policies today. That's a topic that we need to talk about with the full commission. But the question arises, and the discussion needs to begin, about how we're going to deal with I guess several things, and maybe there's others that we could talk about. How we're going to deal with prioritizing the promulgation of these various policies. What's really important to get out there as quickly as we can? What can we take more time to get out? And what can we wait for us at phase 3, for example, to deal with? Secondly, how do we, and by way of example, some of these policies immediately, and let me just point to a couple of examples. Number 1 and 5 on the list really are necessary, or would be helpful, and probably are necessary for communities and for applicants to do some planning. I mean, they need to know what our criteria are if we can publish them. Some are pretty minor, straightforward things. Number 7 deals with what kind of identification we need to buy alcohol in a gaming facility. That's not one that should take very much time to think about at all. The statute requires it, us to put out a regulation dealing with that, but that's not one that is going to take a lot of time. Number 8 is one that may not temporally be important in terms of planning, but really is a major policy decision on the part of the commission, and will require a lot of thought and consideration of the consequences. So these, in the form in which they currently are not differentiated in any of those fashions. Secondly, how are we going to approach the process of figuring out what we need to do in order to make an intelligent decision on these various policies? This list contains 34. There are others. And this list builds on a list that the gaming consultants suggested. There are going to be others. How do we, in a reasonable amount of time, after we've made some priorities, figure out how to approach these so that we get the information we need in order to make an intelligent decision? And then how do we announce the policies so that people understand them? And how do we, in the process of doing this, give people an opportunity at least to have some preliminary comments, recognizing that they'll have another opportunity during the regulation publication process for most of these to submit comments the way they did with the phase one. So those are the kinds of things that it would be useful to discuss today to lead into a more thorough discussion at next Tuesday's meeting when all five of us are together. So.
Well, I like the notion of perhaps grouping or subgrouping these questions in what you already started to articulate. Those that have, where there is value, a lot of value to our stakeholders, our potential applicants, our host and surrounding communities, to at least know where this commission stands, let's say, for planning purposes. I think that's very important. The sooner the better. While not a firm deadline, there's benefit in at least articulating policy-wise where we stand or our interpretation of certain pieces of the statute, etc. There's also others in this group of questions that I see as key from a strategic standpoint, and those we ought to discuss sooner rather than later, if you will.
Can you give an example
Well,
of one or more of those? Just
The one that you highlighted, number 8, I had also highlighted as it's a fundamental approach of the commission. It's purely a discretion of the commission as far as I can read the statute, and one that is perhaps a strategic consideration, if you will. It's not one that we should undertake, anytime soon, by the way, but trying to answer. But it's an important strategic consideration, and that for our benefit, for the benefit of the public interest, we ought to start discussing soon as well. And perhaps there's another element of those that could very easily or should be addressed via regulation, and that can take its parallel course. And we can talk about that as well. I was also thinking, and I want to call the attention to number 4, question number 4 here, just to set a specific example around the subsections in the statute that I believe are also relevant to this sort of information that we will need to ask for. Not only in sections 9 or subsection 9, but you also start. We also articulated here on question 5, sections 18 and sections 15. And I would pose that section 1, where all the paramount goals of the chapter are also articulated. So if we could think of a process of distilling the amount or the type of information that we will require, either in the form of a question or in the form of a document, that will help this commission address all those goals, section 1, 9, 15, 18. I think that may be a worthy initial goal to start to put our arms around all of the information that will either be asked by virtue of the RFP RFP that we will conduct for these licenses, or because we're referencing key pieces of the statute.
So what we're talking about here is, with respect to sections 9, 15, and 18 of the statute, they all lay out a series of criteria that have to be in the application, or we have to use as a criteria for making a licensing decision and the like. But these sections also say that the commission can add other additional criteria or information that they want in the application, or that they can take into account in issuing licenses. So the question is, how do we do that? And section 1 is sort of the general aspirational section that talks about what the statute is supposed to achieve. And your suggestion is that we think about a document in which all of these things can be encapsulated.
To start putting specificity to, some of those questions in those sections are broad, and others, perhaps just by the way they were drafted, are very narrow. I could probably get into examples, but I believe it would be a worthy goal to start adding a level of specificity as to what this commission would want to ascertain in terms of applicants for many
Right.
of all those sections. Can I give one example, because I think this may be sort of illustrative of what I was specifically thinking about. In one of the sections, I believe section 15, the applicant is required to provide to this commission the number of construction hours that the project will require. And I would pose that that's very useful information, but there's a much more important level of detail that we should consider that go along what I believe is intended in that question, and that is if there is any kind of pre-assembly use of materials, from other states, let's say, where the number of construction hours in Massachusetts versus another state starts to make a difference.
So we don't get some prefab casino?
That's right. So that we understand if the intention behind that question is to ascertain just how much construction jobs are going to come to Massachusetts, we should not just ask the construction hours, but how much of pre-assembly somebody may be thinking about, and or describe for us the type of hours. What are they considering behind their sum of total hours? And this is just a specific example as to while some of those questions in the statute seem to be very straightforward.
Right.
There are examples where the paramount goals should be overlaid
Right,
to allow us to get the specific information.
So how do we, in a thorough and thoughtful way, figure out what those kinds of things are? Some we will, by virtue of our backgrounds and experience, will know and think are useful. But that's not enough, it seems to me. So how do we, in a rigorous way, go about figuring out, say, what additional information we should require beyond that specified in the statute and defined by us in the way you've just described, we should require in the application? I mean, how do we approach that task?
I think that may be part of what question 20 in this document started to address, in my opinion, that we should also ponder perhaps with the full commission soon enough, which is what level of expertise will we need or will have to rely on for key aspects of these of the evaluation of these proposals.
That's on the back end, though. We're on the front end now.
Right.
And So we may well need the expertise, similar kinds of expertise on the front end, right?
Or at least a preliminary piece of expertise. Don't forget to ask this question. If you're going to require a financing model, these are the parameters that will help us review the financing structure.
Right.
So a financial advisor may be incumbent upon us to start procuring or thinking about procuring, if that's where we want to go.
I like this approach of trying to couple questions together, ones that pertain to host communities or surrounding communities. Those try to make groupings of these policy questions as we go along. And to the point of you raised the question or the comment about question number 8 of it's more of a fundamental approach. It's not necessarily something that we need to necessarily lay out in regs. But I also think those types of questions are important for us to get public feedback on is part of this this hearing process. But to get to the commission, Mr. Acting Chairman, your point, where do we find the expertise, the knowledge around this? I think we only, in some cases, we can look to the people that we've heard from at the variety of public forums and public hearings that we've had. Because I think a lot of their expertise could be drawn in to talk about these questions. Planning agency types who addressed us on community mitigation issues. To the extent that we have questions about policies related to addressing compulsive gambling needs. We have kind of collected a farm team of people that have offered their opinions and advice already, maybe giving them an opportunity as part of this broad discussion, giving those folks an opportunity to kind of look at these questions and lay them out. We know we've talked to experts in gaming enforcement from other states and other jurisdictions, inviting their feedback, as we know more than one of them have stood up and said, here's my number, call me if you have any questions or we can ever be of any assistance. I don't think we necessarily need to shuttle those people back and forth from where they are, but giving them a chance to, again, couple all these questions by categories or topics and then, put them out there to a lot of the people that we've already heard from who, in my mind, gave us a lot of great insight, from the forums that we've already conducted.
I think that makes sense. And then we have, of course, the gaming consultants, and we have more people that have been, we've met at these various conventions that we're going to. I wonder if it makes sense, once we get our view of the policies we need to encounter and define and set, to make sure we haven't overlooked something. If we post the policy questions that we think are relevant on the website to get public input and input from the applicants as to things they're uncertain about, that they'd like to have us define policies around before we're finished that part of the process. It seems to me we could, the questions that exist probably exist right now, and they're either on this list or they could be added to it very quickly, and then we could proceed. How should we, there are 34 of these things. Our plan, at least in very loose form, is to spend, I think our plan, since we have a plan, is with any fixed contours, is to spend November really working our way through the research that's necessary to deal with educating ourselves about what the content of these policies ought to be, and then to spend the early part of December actually working on the policies in these meetings, a series of these meetings. How should we organize the work that needs to go into the education process so that we can create the base of knowledge we need in order to make intelligent policies. Would it make sense, for example, to divide these up in some fashion and assign some to each commissioner to be primarily responsible?
I think there are obviously questions in here and policy questions in here that are going to be of particular interest to communities. There are going to be policy questions in here that are going to be of interest to everybody, as well as our license applicants. You're going to also find a group of questions in here, which I think you alluded to earlier, are going to be kind of in a phase two. If we think we have all the pertinent policy questions from the 5 commissioners, and I know I've added just a couple on the end, let's take a crack at trying to couple them and how we would categorize them. And then if we do assign, it'd be great if we wound up with 5 categories, but begin to think of people that we would want to make sure are at the table as we kind of do this research, as well as turn to our consultants and see what thoughts they might have on people that we definitely want to hear from, the research that's been done. I mean, we've talked about the benefit of us being the 38th jurisdiction that incorporate gaming, that
Right.
a lot of these questions have probably been answered by somebody
Right.
somewhere.
Right. Right.
Yeah, I would agree that the pragmatic way to go about that comes to mind is to divide and conquer. The time is that there's a multiple constituencies here, research, case studies from other jurisdictions, stakeholders here in the state, varying levels of expertise at the commission, but a growing staff, which will make things a lot more helpful. Just by virtue of our own process, we ought to think about who can take the lead in some of these areas, to the extent that they could be discrete, if you will. Without a doubt, or perhaps without saying, the only mechanism is to come back to these meetings and discuss and update and reconsider or report back. And that's good, and that's the design, the intended design. But I think I see no other way but to try to divide amongst ourselves in one shape or form.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I'm struggling with how we advance the conversation so that we don't just repeat this conversation next week when the others are back, given the constraints of the open meeting law. I mean, we want to obviously comply with that, and yet it's important to take what we've done here and take it to the next step. As I'm listening, I'm hearing a consensus among the 3 of us, at least, I think, that we ought to group these in some fashion. We ought to assign the lead on various groupings or parts of groupings to people to be the lead investigator, and that we ought to get some input from the public as to things that we're missing, and get our own input as to other policies that we need to consider. And it would be ideal, it seems to me, if we could come back next week with a revised document that contained some groupings, some tentative assignments. Maybe that's not possible, but at least some groupings and priorities, so that we could then spend the next week thinking about who was going to do it, and whether it was complete. Perhaps it would be worthwhile to designate Director Glovsky to be the repository of suggestions, and then have a revised document come based on those suggestions for the next meeting. Director Glovsky, is that something that you have the time and capacity to do?
Yes.
And then we can talk a little bit about how mechanically to do that. But that, it seems to me, will take this discussion one step further, and in that process, any additional policy suggestions that aren't here could be added to the list we send to Director Glovsky. And then suggested groupings could be done, and then we could have that document back as the next step. And by then, I think we could have something that's ready to both make assignments and get moving on what we need to do. Plug into the consultants with a comprehensive list, and then post that list right away so that we can get comments to anything that's missing up front, so that we still have time to do it within the month we're going to set aside to do this. Does that make sense?
That approach
Makes total
sounds great.
sense. I would agree with that.
Yeah. So let's follow that out and see if we can't get all that information from the three of us to Director Glovsky soon, and get that process started.
Okay.
For anybody that's watching or has the document now, we'd welcome comments as to policies that are missing and need to be resolved on the strength of what you see here. So you don't have to wait until we take that next cut and do the posting. But at Mass Gaming, MGC comments, is that? Yeah, MGC comments. The normal place for making comments, we would welcome any comments anybody has on that score right now. Okay. Anything more on this topic then? Okay. Let's then move to item 4 on the agenda, which is administration. The first item there, we've already had 4B in the report from the Director of Administration. 4A is personnel searches. I think we don't have to spend much time on this. We have 4 searches in addition to the ones Director Glovsky talked about in progress now. A search for the executive director, which is well in progress. A search for the head of the Investigation and Enforcement Bureau, which also is well in progress. General counsel search is well in progress. An intern or fellow starting lawyer search is well in progress. We welcome Danielle Howe, who is the latest addition to the racing division, who's here to assist Director Durenberger and Commissioner Cameron with those duties. And so it looks like all of those people will be in place well before the end of the year, and then we can move forward from there. Any other things we ought to be thinking about in that area? Okay. So we could have now item 5, which is the first report from our new Director of Racing.
Thank you, Acting Chairman. Good afternoon, Commissioners.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I apologize for not being with you last week. I was in Kentucky attending a welfare and safety of the Racehorse Summit with a number of other directors and equivalent positions from other racing commissions. I picked their brains to the fullest extent possible and told them what your plan was for the racing division within the commission. There were a few panels of interest. One was implementing safety initiatives, and I'll have a report to you by the end of the week, if not sooner, on that. I spent Monday.
Safety, can I just interrupt you there? Safety initiatives for racing participants, is that the main focus of that?
Both
for-
the horse and the other participants,
Uh-huh.
jockeys and drivers,
Uh-huh,
and others who are involved.
Right.
At a more peripheral level, but still involved.
right, right. And what is what was their discussion about the health? Does the health of the horses fit into the safety piece, or is that a separate topic?
It absolutely does, and at the commission level, the policies that are implemented, whether it be granting occupational licenses to the people that take care of the horses, all the way into the post-race testing of horses that have won or have not won when they were expected to win. A lot of the policies and regulations that the commission will put in place directly affect the safety and welfare of the horse.
All right, I look forward to seeing that report.
I did spend Monday at Suffolk Downs viewing operations of the former SRC staff, now under DPL, and just visited the racetrack to see on a live racing day. I'll be doing the same at Plain Ridge on Thursday. I will also be stopping by the Raynham facility to meet with the people there. We are in the process of finalizing a date and time for the working group, which will be a conglomeration of interested stakeholders that are going to give us some input and feedback as we move forward. That's going to be coming very soon.
This is a working group to think at a high level about best practices and the like.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. And to fill us in a little bit, many of us in the racing division are maybe new to the Commonwealth, or at least have not been involved in racing in the Commonwealth, and so they can help point out some areas that may be blind spots for us, or give us a different perspective than what we've seen at the 50,000-foot level,
Right.
as you say.
Right.
So that'll be coming up very soon. There's going to be a number of those meetings. They'll be ongoing. And we welcome all comers, but if there's going to be any sort of deliberation, we recognize we'll have to narrow the pool a little bit. So we'll be asking for sort of a delegate from each stakeholder group to attend the meetings in an ongoing fashion. And then, commissioners, as you know, the Gaming Act, Section 104, mandates that there's a review done of the parimutuel and simulcast law. I'm pleased to report that David Murray has signed on a project basis to help us do that. Ms. Danielle Holmes, which you introduced earlier, she has signed on as a legal assistant with the racing division at this time. And that review basically started in earnest yesterday. They are poring over the statute. And so we've just begun there. The charge is to evaluate the statutes for efficacy and if there's any need to replace going forward. That report is actually due by the end of the year, so there is a sense of urgency there, but I have no doubt that we'll be able to slog through it.
Great, great. Any questions, comments? Well, it sounds like you're off to a great start. So the implementation of the best practices, I know, is something that Commissioner Cameron's been very interested in the beginning, and I know you are as well. No reason that racing in the Commonwealth can't be at a par, if not better, than racing elsewhere. And this comprehensive review of the parimutuel statutes will be very helpful, I think, and may even result in statutes that one can understand, which would be an enormous step forward.
And I would just like to add, I think it's very timely. There are a number of commissions in the country that have been forced to sort of react to things, and I think being proactive. In fact, that was the theme of the Welfare and Safety Summit, was prevention instead of reaction. And so I think that this is an excellent opportunity to ensure that everything that is a very good structure in place
Great.
going forward.
Great. Good. Thank you very much. Okay, the next agenda item is public education and information. And the first issue there is item A1, questions posed by the city of Chelsea after one of our public forums in August, I believe. And these answers we presented in draft at an earlier meeting. They're a familiar now, the issue is a familiar component of our agenda. And we finally have some answers that I've distributed, and I'd welcome any comments from my colleagues. The first question is the only one that I'm going to spend any time on, and that is that there is a fund created by a part of the gaming legislation that's in Chapter 29, Section 2, quadruple E. A number of funds were created in the expanded gaming legislation. The money from the gaming revenues goes into a big fund. It gets put from the big fund into a series of smaller funds, and from the smaller funds distributed to various people, entities, groups in various ways. The fund described in Chapter 29, Section 2, quadruple E, is one of those funds. It's called a Local Capital Projects Fund. The difficulty with that is that although the statute prescribes the money that goes into that fund, there is no description of how the money gets out of the fund. And as a consequence, at the moment at least, it's simply a receptacle for funds that will sit there. So we tried to determine whether the comptroller had some understanding of how the money was to come out, whether this was tied into some portion of other legislation, perhaps that wasn't codified, that we were unaware of, but we've come to a dead end there. So we've got to do more work on trying to find out how that money comes out, perhaps ask for a legislative correction, perhaps in a bill of this magnitude. It's not unusual to find some place where something was just left out, and particularly in the waning moments of the session. And if so, we'll look for some legislative correction and direction. It's not essential now because nothing happens until there are gaming revenues, and there won't be gaming revenues for a while. Plenty of time to fix this, but there is no answer now to what money comes out of that fund. The others, we've revised the answers in accordance with some comments that were made the first time we talked about them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they're ready to go. Is that we prepared to, any comments on those?
No, I think that reviewed them before. I think you articulated well the issue with question one, but I think the response essentially addresses just that. So I think it's a good proposed answers to these questions.
All right. I think, given the length of time that they've been pending, and given the fact that they do embody policy decisions by the commission, I think I would ask for a consensus, at least. I don't think we need a formal vote, that these are answers we can deliver to City Manager Jay Ash on behalf of the commission, and then post them as part of our frequently asked questions, and they embody policies that the commission is prepared to, that the commission embraces and is prepared to proceed with. So I take it we have that consensus.
Yep.
Yes, you do.
Commissioners. All right. Requests from regional groups. Commissioner Stebbins, that item seems aimed at a follow-up, perhaps, to the discussion we had at the last meeting from the regional tourism group. And just to make sure that we had put a cap on that discussion, I think that's why it's on the agenda. Is there anything you want to discuss in connection
No,
with that?
I know we discussed it at, actually, I think at the meeting on the 9th. In reviewing those minutes, I think the chairman said, since the letter had been addressed to him, he was going to address a reply back to the Convention and Visitors Bureau that reflected kind of our current thinking on the issue, obviously, with more to come as Phase 2 regulations get rolled out.
Yeah, the issue there really is how many individual agreements will the commission require in the course of the licensing process? And that will be something that we need to take up as part of the policy decision, not only how many agreements to require, but even if you don't require an agreement, how do you protect a variety of interests that the statute protects? So that's, the formal response is in the chairman's hands, but the policy underlying the question will be addressed as we progress with these policies during the next month. Okay. The next item, 6B, is the United Auto Workers Workplace Safety presentation. That was scheduled for today. We'd invited them to join us at their request, but through some issues beyond their control, they couldn't join us today, and I think we're going to have them at a future meeting. Okay. Okay. And that brings us to item 7, the research agenda. Commissioner Zuniga, that's in your court.
I can provide a little update for some consideration and perhaps discussion, or just for information. And Chairman Crosby talked a little bit about this last week as we were plowing through the very thoughtful and sometimes a little lengthy responses that we obtained to our request for information as to how to go about implementing the mandates in the statute relative to research and the research agenda. I would encourage all the commissioners to read through some of the questions or the questions that and the responses. But I will summarize that there are two perhaps competing themes here, and or two broad themes within these responses. On the one hand, there's this realization about measuring social and economic, especially social, impact of problem gambling is difficult. The field is new. Some of the research done to this effect is inconclusive. There's a fundamental difficulty because, as per one of the responses, at least 96% of the people with problem gambling have some other kind of addiction or behavioral problem. So that essentially has this comorbidity problem, if you will, as to how to isolate the problem of problem gambling being really difficult. Some of the other difficulties have to do with the low prevalence of the general population. So ascertaining, identifying changes in behavior is a real challenge. It has to be done with the usual methods of surveying have to be complemented with other indirect methods, and that's almost by definition a real challenge. On the flip side, the legislation is very specific relative to, and very clear relative to our mandate. And we are in a unique opportunity to really do this research and think about it when it matters the most, which is prior to the introduction of casinos in Massachusetts. So not only is the statute prescriptive, but also it gives us the funding. So we have a mandated funding, a funded mandate, if you will, which again we have to act on. So with that background, again, I would encourage you to at least focus on all of the respondents' answers to the first question, which was our question as to the general recommendations. And everybody who responded is a very good writer by their own merits, and they articulate and summarize those very well. One of the things that I would say is also a common theme is this notion of implementing a rigorous peer review procedure, if you will, in all the research that this commission will eventually either conduct or cost to conduct. Again, that's also a very important theme. And a clear recommendation that all policy decisions be made by these, with this in mind, that all research will be peer reviewed and published in reputable science journals. But we also need to start thinking about our immediate next steps because timing will soon be of the essence. This baseline study, we understand that it could take anywhere between a year or a little bit more. And there's a report due to the legislature by the end of 2013 with the findings of that baseline study, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to move soon. And as part of our next steps, we need to think about whether we conduct an RFP, and if so, what do we conduct it for? And there's a particular piece that I wanted to sort of highlight. Some of the recommendations here recommend that we establish a research bureau or a research center. And we fund that, of course. And that bureau, perhaps not unlike the investigations bureau, whether it's partially staffed by somebody working for the commission or it's contracted out with a research institute, that bureau becomes the repository and the project management type organization for all the research that is either conducted there or commissioned out of there, and then peer reviewed out of that. So how we go about creating or requesting a response for that bureau is one of our immediate next questions or next steps. There's also this other idea relative to a scientific advisory panel. Although the legislation has this gaming policy, establishes this gaming policy advisory committee, that committee will be likely an unpaid committee that will come together perhaps at different times. But there's a recognition or there's a case to be made that this process may be very well served if we have some kind of scientific advisory committee. And the question becomes separate from this gaming policy advisory committee. And the question becomes whether that should be a compensated committee or not, because there could be some real hours, if you will, spent in analyzing the processes and the research that will take place as part of this effort. So those were two very large questions initially that we thought. I just wanted to kind of mention and kind of throw out there. We will have to ponder them soon if we decide to request in the open procurement mode a request for proposal for this research bureau, or whether we may want to enter into an ISA, let's say, with the likes of the University of Massachusetts, because they are, like ourselves, an instrumentality of the Commonwealth.
If we have to produce a report that we can convey to the legislature by the end of next year, right?
Correct.
And if we contracted with somebody or entered an ISA with somebody to do the research that was necessary to file that report, we could, and decided to have a research bureau of our own of some kind, we could build the research bureau on top of whatever substantive knowledge that report produced, right?
Absolutely.
In other words, we wouldn't have to have the bureau there in order to produce this report. If, again, thinking about priorities and overall things. And could we identify a number of, this report is a comprehensive report, much broader than problem gaming, although problem gaming is a piece of it. Are there things that we could identify that we want tracked, just 7 or 8 or 10, 15 things that we want tracked that are not subject to the comorbidities and things like that would be at least something that we could get started with? Does that theme run through these reports as well?
Yes.
In other words, if you, just to use a concrete example, if you wanted to look at housing prices, if you wanted to look at traffic patterns, if you wanted to look at education requirements in surrounding communities, those kinds of things. Those are things as to which fairly hard metrics are available, right? You could create a baseline now in those areas without, he says naively, much difficulty.
Yes, yes, and the challenge becomes perhaps figuring out what those variables
Right,
are.
right.
The variables that we want to measure and make part of this baseline that we in the future may come back and check against as to the differential, what those variables may be.
Right.
And to the extent that we load up the cart with more and more, the more difficult and expensive that it gets. Perhaps to state the obvious. But there are, so there are some, if I may, some that may be very straightforward. Housing
Right.
starts or housing stock in a particular
Right.
community,
Right.
vacancy, just to keep
Right.
on the issue of housing. It could be they're publicly available already or readily available. But there are, by virtue of the some of the other variables, there are some difficulties, particularly when we get into social costs.
Right.
And or some of the other adverse impact, and that starts to get challenging quickly because of this confounding or comorbidity, and also this low prevalence, if you will, when it comes to the general population. I'll perhaps expound a little bit. The general methods of surveying are more and more challenging. Because of technology, caller ID, and cell phones, what used to be a very reliable telephone survey approach, actually as late as 1996, as I understand it, is radically changed in the last few years. I myself don't answer almost anything that I don't recognize in the caller ID at home, and I'm perhaps one of the few that still have a landline among my friends.
That's why you won't return calls.
I may now, by the way. I may now answer more surveys. But so the methods have become increasingly, by necessity, more sophisticated, but sometimes more indirect. Some email surveys, there's usually and there's a competing time. The more questions that you ask, the more that you really lose your audience, as we understand it. So the reliance has been more and more on indirect methods. Just to stay on the problem gambling, the use of services, the number of calls, the amount of people that enter self-exclusion problems, etc. that the differential across time on some of those services become a big factor in determining, again, incidence and impact. None of which help us with the baseline study, which is essentially what we are, I shouldn't say none of which helps us in a limited way, as we are trying to ascertain this longitudinal study, starting with the baseline.
So that's the kind of thing you mean by this, trying to measure the social cost, not the
Right.
social cost of traffic jams.
Right. Well, the presence of a casino.
Right. Right, no,
you know,
yeah.
or,
Right. Right.
There's also even some dispute among the research community as to what constitutes a social cost and purely a transfer. I'm just going to repeat one of the examples. If I steal from my wife, is that a transfer or a social cost? Which sounds kind of silly when one ponders it, but
You have
but
to
it's-
ask your wife.
Exactly. Well, but it's the level of thinking that comes to what exactly constitutes a social cost.
So how do you, we can't do it today, but how, is there an approach to trying to deal with this that you think we could use? By this, I mean, trying to decide what it is we want to measure, or how we want to approach the creation of a measurement process, so we can take the next step, because that's another thing we've got to do before
Yeah.
the end of the year.
Yeah. Well, perhaps if there's any insight as to all of these very complicated questions, I got to think, because there's all these difficult questions, maybe that really merits this notion of the research bureau. Something that we fund that is outside of, and I use that term perhaps loosely, that resides elsewhere from this commission, and that will be staffed or will be funding people who have been thinking about this for a lot more years than we have. And they themselves could be the ones thinking as to how to go about requesting proposals, funding specific elements of the research, or measuring specific questions, or going about and researching specific dimensions. That may be the best way to go. Pragmatically, because this could be a very lengthy or very long effort, that could bode well with entering into an ISA with someone like the University of Massachusetts, because it's again a sister agency in some degree, an agency that will be here for a lot longer, and it could be one thing to consider, but that doesn't take away from our ability to issue an RFP, let's say, and to rethink who may be our research bureau. We don't have to have a research bureau, the same one, year after year. So-
Wait, give me some clarification as to this scientific advisory panel. Are those people that are the peer review for our results, or are these people that look at the methodologies by which we're evaluating and assessing the information?
It could actually be either or both. There's, in other words, the peer review discipline could be at the advisory level for everything that the Bureau conducts, or at the individual level for each of the studies, to perhaps simplify it. And I guess that's a question that we ought to consider.
Because it'd be interesting, I mean, getting back to your piece of how people conduct gather information anymore. I would have to think that there are folks in the private sector, even as we're in the final weeks of a presidential campaign, I mean, the strategic processes that those folks are using to identify their market and get feedback from those people in the market through social media meetings, through online things, through looking at what you subscribe to, I mean, any number of factors. I mean, it might be interesting to kind of build those people into the mix as well to make sure that the information we're gathering is correct, not just how we're assessing the information. I think it's critical to have, this conversation, obviously, with DPH, since they're going to be in charge of
Yes.
the research fund, and it may be, they may give us thoughts on a research bureau idea, but have you entertained that conversation?
Oh, yeah,
or
yeah,
that
we've
conversation?
had, Chairman Crosby has had some, discussions. Of course, this is all in conjunction with them. The way the statute gives us the authority to dictate and be as prescriptive as we may want in terms to DPH relative to that research agenda, however. So we could be very prescriptive, we could be very involved, or we could be hands-off. And, again, that's a major policy that we ought to start thinking about.
In terms of the Gaming Policy Advisory Committee, and obviously some of the seats are pretty prescriptive as to who's got to sit in those seats. Should we be looking at recommending to some of the appointing authorities the types of people, as opposed to, you get 5 seats, we can tell you from what we look at our future needs to be, it'd be great if there was somebody who had a background in research. Maybe that gets us around the scientific advisory panel, and it stands up that our gaming policy group, if they're going to offer their research agenda, or give direction to a research agenda every year, that maybe we can urge or recommend that some of the slots that may not be as prescriptive give us an opportunity to say, it'd be great if somebody from this type of background was sitting in one of your appointments.
It's an interesting thought. I kept thinking about how to integrate, or whether it should really just be one, perhaps to your point, one advisory or policy committee, if you will. But I know Chairman Crosby has had some initial discussions, from what I understand, as to the necessity of forming this advisory group, the Gaming Policy Advisory Group, sooner rather than later. Now, as to whether he's been thinking that we should try to suggest profiles of the people who should be there, I don't know, but that's an interesting suggestion.
Just in order to kind of not have to create another entity, but I still see the argument of, the professional hell may be one that we only turn to once a year.
Yeah.
And it may have to come at an expense.
Yeah. Well, if I'm not mistaken, the Gaming Policy Advisory Group is broad.
Mhm.
And there's a subcommittee that's particularly dedicated to the research question.
Right.
So while the appointing authorities have broad discretion as to who may be at the Gaming Policy Advisory Committee.
Some of the smaller subcommittee
subcommittees
appointments are more prescriptive.
Could have more prescriptive, right. So perhaps that's kind of the compromise. You reminded me of something that I want to highlight, which is the response from the MIT was very narrow but very insightful. It talks about something that is going to be tremendously helpful to this commission, which is how we are going to contract with a nonprofit, and there's different ways to go about doing this, who will anonymize proprietary data of the casinos and provide us with behavioral patterns to inform problem gambling. That's a particular section in the legislation that must have had a lot of study, and is something that, again, I will call your attention because it's if nothing else, it's very interesting. It's a little for later because that doesn't really happen to have much direct correlation to the baseline study. It comes as to how we then collect data of behavior. That's going to be a very important wealth of data that will help with all this problem gambling effort, and even social impacts, perhaps. So.
I am listening to this discussion, thinking that there is, and this isn't any enormously insightful comment, a real divide between the kind of soft social cost analysis. I mean soft in the sense that you don't have hard metrics to deal with it. And it's really hard to figure out how you go about measuring that. And that, the figuring out how to measure that in and of itself is a project. And on the other hand, we have stuff that can be measured and that's there. Is there a way to get the stuff that has hard metrics available to measure it by started while we figure out the softer, how to approach the softer things? I'm concerned a little bit about establishing the baseline and the need to do so in order to get helpful statistics before the construction actually starts, because the fact that the construction starts, maybe the fact that the construction start has been announced, begins to change some things in the way of housing patterns, perhaps, a variety of different things. And the problem gambling piece and the impact of the problem gambling piece and separating out all the comorbidities is going to take place a little bit farther down the road. And so if we don't bifurcate the process, we may lose an opportunity to get the really reliable baselines we need in order to measure some things, while still having an opportunity to figure out how to measure the other things later with an equally accurate baseline. It's not going to be affected by the announcement that a gaming license, a gaming facility is going to go someplace. Is that something that might be worth thinking about?
Yeah, absolutely. To the extent, and I keep thinking of this notion of a survey, and it should not be thought of as an all-encompassing, which is perhaps what you're alluding to. To the extent that the baseline study is only envisioned, and it's only envisioned to be a survey that will have however many variables that will study longitudinally, then we will run into the problems that you're alluding to, because we'll miss other important pieces of data, perhaps.
Right.
So I suspect that the answer is the survey may be only one element of many others that could be taken at different times with different approaches.
What's the next step for this?
Well, if nothing else, as I mentioned, just reporting on some of that. I think we ought to think about if we are going to issue an RFP for this effort, what that would be, if it is for the likes of a single point of contact type bureau that could then think about the scope, think about the approach, the methodology of any one of the components of the research piece. We could start writing something to that effect.
But that in itself is a policy decision.
That in itself is a
Right.
policy decision.
Why don't we put this on the agenda again next week with this conversation as a backdrop and the other two commissioners here, and
That's a good
see if
idea.
we can't make that policy decision as to the direction we want to go, or maybe we want to go in two directions simultaneously, and then move this forward. We have those responses to the RFI, and they're available for us to read, and then move this forward and either draft an RFP for a bureau or draft an RFP for a project, or do both.
Precisely.
Yeah, okay.
Good suggestion.
Interesting.
All right, all right. That gets us to the end of the agenda items that are laid out there. Is there any other business that falls into the last catch-all category? I have none, can think of none. So I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All right, all in favor?
Second.
Aye.
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 All right, thank you all.
Thank you.